In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make the copper dress from start to finish. This pattern can be found at dittopatterns.com and is customizable by length and sleeve style. You can also enter your own measurements to get a custom fit. I start by cutting out the front and back pieces. Depending on the length of your garment, you may need to use splicing to cut your full piece. To use the splicing feature, lay your fabric on your cutting mat folded in half. Line it up to the cut on fold line of your garment. Use the stickers provided with your ditto and line them up with the red marks on your pattern. Begin cutting your garment on the line shown. Take a moment to mark any notches needed on your pattern, including the center front line. Transfer those markings to the other side of your pattern. Next, in the app, click the red arrow to move your pattern piece on the cutting mat. See how it moves over. Take off your pattern weights and slide your fabric to match up the lines and those red markers. Once lined up, you can continue cutting your pattern piece. Repeat this process for the back pieces. This piece is not cut on the fold because it has a keyhole detail. Cut with the line shown. Mark your notches. And move your pattern piece in the app. Realign the red markers and continue cutting. Next, we can cut out our sleeve pieces. I'm also taking a moment to cut out my facing pieces as well. Each sleeve will need one of these ruffle pieces. They get cut on the fold. Next, cut out interfacing for our facings. Because I'm using a knit for this pattern, I'm going to use a stretch fusible interfacing. The center front facing is cut on the fold. The back facing is 2 pieces and is not cut on the fold. The first step is to sew the center back seam of the dress. Because I'm sewing knits on my sewing machine, I'm going to use a small zigzag stitch. Next, we can sew the shoulder seams. I'm using clips to hold the shoulder seams together before sewing. In the previous step, I used a sewing machine to sew the center back seams. A serger is great for sewing knits. Use whichever machine you have and would like to use. Next, I'm going to line up my side seams and pin or clip in place. Use your serger or sewing machine to sew the side seams. Remember that the seam allowance is 5/8 inch. Next, we'll interface the facings. Line up your interfacing with your facing piece. Press using an iron. The interfacing packaging will tell you what settings are best for the interfacing. Repeat on the other 2 facing pieces. Next, we'll attach the shoulder seams of our facings. I like to take a moment to finish the outside edge of my facing. I'm using a serger for this, but you can also do a zigzag on the edge. Next step is to sew the center back underneath the keyhole of the facing. Once the facing is sewn, we can attach it to the neckline of our garment. Use the shoulder seams as well as your notches to line everything up around the neckline. I like to mark the seam allowance around the keyhole so that it's perfect when sewing. I'm starting at the bottom of the keyhole and sewing with that 5/8 seam allowance around the neckline. When sewing a corner, continue on to that corner, drop the needle, lift your foot, and pivot your fabric. You can then drop the foot and continue sewing. Because this garment has a keyhole that will need a button closure, you could install an elastic loop or fabric loop at this area. At the end of this tutorial, I will show you how to make a daisy chain loop. Once the neckline is sewn, take a moment to cut down your seam allowances and clip around any curves. Be sure not to clip through your newly sewn seam. Next, turn your garment right side out. Be sure to press out the keyhole area and all your seams. Pull the facing towards the inside of the garment. Next, press the facing. When pressing a facing, roll it slightly in so that the front fabric shows. This will ensure that your facing does not show from the outside. Next, we will understitch the facing. This step also helps the facing from rolling out to the front of your garment. With all the seam allowances pressed towards your facing, stitch just 1/4 of an inch to the inside of the seam. This holds down the seam allowance and keeps your facing from rolling up. Next, you can tack the facing to the seam allowances at the shoulder. This can be done by machine or with a hand sewing needle and thread. Give the garment another press at the neckline. Now that the neckline is complete, we can move on to our sleeves. Start by sewing the inseam of your sleeve. Use pins or clips to hold it in place before sewing. Repeat on both sleeves. You can also pin or clip the inseam of the ruffle that goes onto the sleeve. Stitch all 4 seams with a 5/8 seam allowance on your sewing machine or serger. To attach the ruffle to the sleeve, line up those inseams as well as any other markings. Pin or clip all around. Sew around the sleeve to attach the ruffle. Next, we can attach the sleeve to the dress. We're going to use the markings to line up the sleeve. On this pattern, there are 2 notches in the back and 1 in the front. You can also use the underarm seam as a reference point as well as the shoulder seam. The cap of the sleeve is going to be slightly larger than the arm's eye. Just pull gently to line up the sleeve as you pin it or clip it in place. Next, attach the sleeve using a serger or a sewing machine. If you are a beginner sewist, a sewing machine might be a little bit easier. Remember, the cap of the sleeve is slightly larger than the arm's eye hole, so you'll have to pull gently as you sew. Repeat these steps to attach the other sleeve. For this one, I'm using a sewing machine to show you the difference. I have it set on a slight zigzag. Again, you'll pull gently as you're sewing the cap so that everything fits into place. Next, we'll hem up the bottom of the dress. Take note of the measurement in the instructions. For this dress, I'm hemming up 5/8 of an inch. I'm using a hem gauge and my iron to press the hem into place. I did finish the bottom of my raw edge with my serger, but you could also use a zigzag stitch. You can also use this hem method for the sleeve ruffle. To hem knits, I like to use a twin needle. To thread your machine for a twin needle, you'll need 2 spools of thread. Once the 2 spools are set into your machine, thread them like you normally would. When you get to the needle, insert a twin needle. One thread will go into the left needle and the other into the right. Your bobbin threading stays the same. Now that my needle is threaded, I can begin hemming my garment. When hemming with a twin needle, you're going to sew on the front of the dress. I love this hem because it looks professional and it stays stretchy. Be sure that your machine is set on a regular straight stitch before sewing. You may need to adjust the tension or your stitch length. The final step is to add a button and loop to the keyhole to close it. As I said previously, you could add an elastic loop or a fabric loop in this keyhole as you're sewing it, but here is a way to add an exterior chain loop to your garment. I started with my thread doubled into my needle with a knot. I then create smaller knots by pulling the thread through the loop to create a chain. Once your chain is the length of the button you are using, you can reattach it to the other end of your garment. Slide your needle into the knot and pull to secure the chain. This is a great way to create an almost invisible loop. You can then attach a button to the other side. I like using a small shank button for this dress. We'd love to see your finished dress. Share and tag us at Ditto Patterns. For more tips, tricks, and tutorials, check out our email newsletter at dittopatterns.com and subscribe to our YouTube channel.